Thank you, Skip. Thank you, Nikolai, for the great introduction. Thank you to the Clinton School of Public Service for having me, and thank you more than everything for everybody coming out here tonight. I'm going to tell you a story about greed tonight. Now, this isn't your run-of-the-mill greed where you hear about it and you feel sorry for someone and you forget about it a couple minutes later. This is a sneaky kind of greed, the kind that happens in boardrooms, on golf courses, and maybe even in a gentleman's club or two. This is the kind of greed that happens because men are told every day that what they're doing is wrong, and they still ignore it, and they still don't listen to the people who actually count. Do me a favor. Turn to the right, look at the person next to you. Except for the people on the edge there. That person is a victim of this greed. Turn to the left, look at the person next to you there. Same thing with that person. Everyone in this room, you included, me included, whether you are a football fan or not, ends up bearing the brunt of what is wrong because of the Bowl Championship Series. Now, I imagine most of you here know what the BCS is. To me, it will always be known as the Great Satan of Sports. That was actually the title of our book before the publishers made us go with the much more subtle Death to the BCS. For those unfamiliar, the BCS is supposed to be a conduit to determine a true national champion. Now, what happened is, back a couple decades ago, and even up until 1997, sports writers voted and coaches voted, and they would have different opinions of who should win the national championship in college football. The BCS was supposed to be the solution to that. Instead, the BCS continues to stake its claim as the worst idea of our lifetime, alongside New Coke and parachute pants and snakes on a plane and every other disastrous thing that's been out there. Only the problem is, people drank New Coke, and people wore parachute pants, and people actually saw snakes on a plane. Nobody likes the BCS, and I mean nobody from the inception, aside from the people who have been paid to do it. We like to call them the cartel, and they're made up of the conference commissioners and the bowl directors and the athletic directors, this shadowy cabal who continues to perpetuate this insanity on college football and on the game. And if you are going to be a victim, I suppose that it's best to describe to you the crimes that are being committed against you. Now, up until this year, frankly, they were more moral and ethical than anything. How bowl games, the purveyors of nostalgia that are actually the black hearts of college football, siphon off money from universities, money that can be used for everything from scholarships to books to subsidizing ticket prices. How the directors of these bowl games make $3 and $4 and $5, upwards of $800,000 a year to put on one single game. How the BCS's sole purpose to create a 1 versus 2 matchup ends up tarnished by polls that are put on by people who frankly have no business voting, and by computer systems that the people who run admit are not nearly as good as they ought to be. And how the bowl directors end up using booze and food and graft of all kinds to keep us from having the one thing that every true college football fan wants, a playoff system. And in that vein, how the most important people to college football, people like yourselves, people like me, the fans who pack stadiums every Saturday, millions of people, loathe the BCS. Sports Illustrated ran a poll a few years back that asked how many people dislike the BCS. It was 90%. And honestly, I don't think that's right. After having written this book, it's more like 99%. And that makes sense because if we're talking about the true 1% in this country, that's the BCS. And never was that more evident than last year when the Fiesta Bowl, one of the 4 BCS bowls, released its internal report looking into itself and all of the improprieties that had happened within the bowl. The Fiesta had been run for decades by a man named John Junker. Now, John Junker made about $600,000 a year, which is Pretty decent salary. John Junker also had a corporate credit card that over the previous 10 years, he used to charge $4.8 million. I'm a writer, I don't do math, but we broke it down. That's $1,330 a day spent over 10 years. He bought himself and his cronies a foursome of golf with Jack Nicklaus. He sent a coworker on her honeymoon. John Junker knew one language: bribery. And you knew this when he sent a bouquet of flowers to the graduate school director of the place where his daughter wanted to go at the University of Texas and charged it to the Fiesta Bowl. Now, soon enough, John Junker may find himself under indictment, like the COO of the Fiesta Bowl is, for illegally funneling money into campaigns throughout the state of Arizona. We don't know about that yet. It seems like it's a fait accompli at this point. For decades, though, John Junker epitomized the bowl system. He would steal money from a patsy, which is the university. He would lavish it on the rainmakers, like athletic directors and like conference commissioners and like people of that ilk. And he did that so he could keep the Fiesta Bowl from losing its status as one of the BCS bowls alongside the Orange Bowl, the Rose Bowl, and I'm pulling a Rick Perry right now. Sugar Bowl, thank you. I should have known, Arkansas, you guys went to the Sugar Bowl. I'll get to that later, I promise. And if you think about it, the scheme is absolutely brilliant. Somehow these bowl games have inserted themselves as a middleman into the most profitable product that college athletics has. It's postseason. They've made themselves feel like they're vital to the sport, that they're important, and in decades, they have robbed them absolutely blind, and it comes down back to the university level every single year. The BCS's emergence in 1997 only solidified this by adding significance to the bowl games and limiting the participants to the 6 power conferences. What it did was wring every last droplet it could from the system. And that's funny because these bowls, the vast majority, I believe it's 29 of 35, are 501c3 tax-exempt organizations, which of course are better known as nonprofits. Now, that's a complete misnomer, of course. The profits are massive, and few bowls leached off of the people who played in them quite like the Fiesta Bowl. All you have to do is look at last year's matchup. Oklahoma versus the University of Connecticut. Now, UConn's an interesting case. For years, it had wanted a big football program to match its basketball program. And it jumped up from Division I AA, a lower level, to Division I. Within that decade, the program had grown. It won a conference, the Big East, that frankly wasn't very good and got invited to the Fiesta Bowl. Now, this is how the bowl games truly fleece their partners. There's something called the ticket guarantee that's attached to every bowl game out there. What happens is, in order to participate in these games, you have to buy X amount of tickets. For some lower level bowl games, it's 10,000. Connecticut had to buy 17,500 full price, face value tickets, some that cost $150, some $200, up to $300. Then it was the school's responsibility to convince its alumni and fans to not only shell out full price for tickets, but fly all the way across country to Arizona to go do it. And so of those 17,500 tickets, the University of Connecticut sold 2,771. They lost $2.9 million on tickets alone. Just let that resonate. $2.9 million on tickets alone. And the problem was the $20 million payout that the Fiesta Bowl and the other bowls supposedly guarantee, all that bowl payout money gets pooled and split up evenly among the teams in each conference. And so ultimately, Connecticut lost $1.7 million for the distinct privilege of paying for John Junker's visits to strip clubs and his garish yellow blazers that he would wear around all the time. This happens everywhere. More than half of the bowl games would die without the subsidization that schools have by giving them these ticket guarantees. And you know what? The vast majority of university administrators, unfortunately, stand up for this because of quid pro quo. Shouldn't Dave Gerhardt have said something in January? Bless the Razorbacks. They went to the Sugar Bowl. their biggest bowl game in 25 years, a huge accomplishment for the university, for Bobby Petrino, for everyone. It should have been a great moment. Razorbacks were required to buy 20,374 tickets for the Sugar Bowl. Now, they sent 18,000 fans down there, which is awfully impressive considering we're in the middle of a recession and that New Orleans is an 8-hour drive away and that flying down there is a logistical nightmare. And still, the athletic department lost $342,980 on tickets alone that weren't sold. And this is where it comes back to you. Ultimately, that money, no matter how self-sufficient the Arkansas athletic department may be, you still have to pay for $65 tickets. And you still have to pay for Bobby Petrino being the highest paid employee in the state at $3.6 million, and Mike Anderson being the second highest at $1.6 million, and 5 of the top 10 state employees in Arkansas being from the athletic department at the university. Why do schools do this to themselves? Why do they do this to you? Why do they do this to us? Why do they allow bowl games to reap tens of millions of dollars that is not due to them, that they have done nothing for? Why doesn't that money go toward infrastructure or buildings or academics or coaches' salaries or even subsidizing ticket prices? Why do we continue to perpetuate this horrible cycle? What we found, unfortunately, is not a very satisfying answer. It's just the truth. The presidents listen to the people underneath them. And while under normal circumstances I would applaud hands-off behavior from bosses, you have to understand that these bosses are getting 5, nearly 6-figure bonuses for just going to a bowl game. And that the Orange Bowl is taking them on a cruise. And this cruise is where they got to drink something called Coco Locos. And they got taken to the Fiesta Frolic, which was a golf outing that the Fiesta Bowl put on every year, where they would just feed them liquor all weekend long and laugh about the wonderful lives that they lead. Doesn't matter if the school deserves to go to the game. Doesn't matter if you're 6-6. Doesn't matter if your school is going to lose money on the game. The athletic director, the coach, everyone ends up profiting from it. All it takes is a 500 record. And there are people petitioning now in order to let teams without a 500 record into bowl games because they've got 70 spots to fill and only 120 teams in Division 1A. Now, not every university is on board with this. At Boise State University in Idaho, they have built one of sports' great stories. I'm not talking just college football, all of sports. A commuter school somehow has ended up with the winningest program in college football. They've lost 10 games in the last 10 years. 4 of those years, they went undefeated. And what do they get for that? Not a chance at the national championship. Boise State, you see, spent a decade outside of the 6 power conferences. And since I keep bringing them up, there's, of course, the SEC with Arkansas. There's the Big East, the Big Ten, the ACC, the Pac-12, and the Big 12, which is made up of 9 teams. And that's how much sense college football makes these days. 11 times a team has gone undefeated since the BCS started and not gone to the national championship game. Bill Hancock, the executive director of the BCS, has said that he wants to offer the people who didn't make it to these championship games despite going undefeated a nice pat on the back. Now, Bill is something of a stooge for the BCS, but the point here remains. The NCAA hands out 87 championships every single year, and they are all determined by a playoff. The only NCAA-sanctioned sport that doesn't have an NCAA-recognized championship or a playoff is the best one of all, college football. Why is that the case? You know, when Dan Wetzel and I were reporting this book with Josh Peter, Dan and I were trying to put together something for our website, you know, a running gag that we could have, and we came up with something called If Real Life Were Like the BCS. If real life were like the BCS, we wouldn't have ever had the wheel because it's so much fun dragging things uphill. Fire? Who needs it? I like it when it's cold outside, and I love eating raw meat. If real life were like the BCS, Or if the NFL, rather, were like the BCS, Roger Goodell, the commissioner, would say, you know what, why don't we hold our playoffs at stadiums that aren't our own? And why don't we just give them 40% of our profits because they seem like really nice guys? And if America were like the BCS, we would elect presidents because they have the same last name as their father. That's a bad example. If real life were like the BCS, 1 + 1 would equal 247. The BCS formula, which selects the 2 teams for the championship game, is probably the most laughable part of the whole system. And that's really saying something. Now, there are 2 polls that are involved in the BCS formula. There is the coaches poll and the Harris poll. The coaches poll is supposed to be made up of coaches. Ultimately, their secretaries or sports information directors end up casting the vote for them. The Harris poll is even better. The Harris poll is made up of people on the periphery of the sport. And I really do mean the periphery, because when the New York Times a few years ago went to track down a Harris poll voter, they found him at a construction site, and he had to turn off his jackhammer before he did the interview. And just today, there was a story out about how somebody spoke with a voter from Iowa who had University of Houston at number 5 and Oklahoma State, presumptively the number 2 or 3 team in the country, at number 6. He admitted he didn't do enough research, and then he went on to say he thinks the BCS is a total sham. And these polls count for 2/3 of the BCS. Now, the third is comprised from the rankings of 6 mathematical formulas. I could go on about just how backward these are, from the fact that we don't know what the formulas are, and we can't check them because they're proprietary mathematical information, and they refuse to release them. I mean, the one person who does release it last year twice had an error in his standings that was caught. And the last one was in the last standings, and he ended up having to revise, ultimately, the whole BCS because of it. Now, it didn't affect the 1 versus 2 teams, and margin of victory is another thing. They are not allowed to use margin of victory. So a 70-3 win is the exact same thing as a 7-3 win. I could go on and on about this system, and frankly, that's what made this book so much fun to write. That's what this is about. The people who are in charge are greedy. It's not just that they want tons of money. It's not that they want the whole pie. They just want to be the ones holding the knife. They could stockpile all the money around, and I'll get to just how much money they're leaving on the table. But to them, the system is good right now, and they take the attitude, if it ain't broke, no need to fix it. For the rest of us, of course, it seems like it's broken beyond repair. It's not. And while this is a huge part of our book, I want to say that any playoff system aside from the BCS, whether it is a 4-team playoff, an 8-team playoff, or as we advocate, a 16-team playoff works. Now, Dan conceived this idea of the 16-team playoff nearly a half a decade ago. And amid all the realignment and all the changes in college football, it still stands up. Here's the plan. There are 11 conferences throughout college football. If you win your conference, you are in the playoff. Now, it could be the Sun Belt Conference with Arkansas State, it could be the Mid-American Conference, it could be the Western Athletic Conference, it doesn't matter. This takes care of the fairness aspect. This means if you go undefeated, you are going to be in the playoff. It is as simple as that. You also have 5 at-large teams that are chosen by a selection committee, which seeds the teams 1 through 16. Now, the top 8 seeds get to play home games. This incentivizes the regular season, makes every game truly worth it. And can you imagine what a game in December in Razorback Stadium with 80,000 people chanting for the Razorbacks would feel like? Just how good that would be. As nice as the Sugar Bowl seems, as nice as the Cotton Bowl seems, that one home game would be the biggest game ever played in this state. I'm certain of that. And I'm going to tell you who they'd play in just a few minutes. Best of all, there's no anger over where you're actually playing because you supposedly don't travel well. There's no Michigan or Virginia Tech being in the Sugar Bowl because supposedly the Sugar Bowl doesn't think that Arkansas is going to bring enough fans along. Now, the home games would last the first 3 rounds, and we have under our plan the national championship game being played at the Rose Bowl. Now, it could rotate among different sites if you really want that. We're not wedded to that. We're not dogmatic about it, but we feel like the Rose Bowl really stands for everything that the bowl system should stand for. They give back. They're involved with their community. They don't hold cruises or golf tournaments or anything like that. They're about the game itself. And instantaneously, this 4-week, 16-team, 15-game playoff would become the second biggest sporting event in America. Now, nothing's going to beat the Super Bowl at the NFL playoffs. I understand that. I cover Major League Baseball all the time. This would be bigger than the World Series. This would be bigger than the NBA Finals. This would even be bigger than the NCAA tournament because it would wed the playoff format that we adore so much with our national pastime these days, football. Now, I'm glad that I'm sharing a byline with Dan on this book because he's a lot smarter than I am, and he came up with this. And we tried to talk with as many smart people as we could just to determine how much this would actually be worth. Now, the consensus was around $750 million, but I think they're wrong. This is $1 billion property now. It's worth $1 billion because I think over the last couple of years, you see the way television contracts have exploded. People recognize that sporting events are the only DVR-proof thing out there. You don't go and record a football game or a basketball game and go check it later and scroll through the commercials because you're going to run into the score on the web or hear it on the radio or read it on Twitter. You could get all of this money, all of it, and you could still have the bowl system concurrently. You could still do that because, frankly, the only reason the bowl system exists now is because it's subsidized by those bigger games. Now, the BCS tries to tell you otherwise, and that's where they try and win this battle. They try and win it in the spin room. They know the system can't hold up to logic and fact. It's why they try and say the bowl system would die. It wouldn't. It's why they try to say coaches and players want a bowl system and don't want a playoff. Not true either. It's why they try and argue that the regular season is tantamount to a playoff. Frankly, based on the last couple weeks of the year when there were 2 or 3 games that meant anything, it's not. And it's why on Capitol Hill in 2009, a man named Derek Fox, who gets paid $420,000 to run something called the Alamo Bowl, stood before Congress and over 38 words told perhaps the most egregious statement ever made in Washington, which is really saying something. Now, there were 3 complete mistruths that he spoke, and I want to read the direct quote here from him. Almost all the postseason games are put on by charitable groups, and since up to 1/4 of the proceeds from the games are dedicated to the community, local charities receive tens of millions of dollars a year. Now, that sounds great, right? It sounds like you're giving money back. These bowl games are so important to the community. Well, the fact is, nonprofit status does not equate with charity by any means. And when he said up to 1/4, he actually meant like 1 or 2%. Because that year, the nonprofit bowl games, we went through the tax records for all of them, the nonprofit bowl games that year made $186 million in revenue. They gave $3.3 million back to charity. And more than half of that came from the Orange Bowl and the Chick-fil-A Bowl. Still, that day, the Associated Press story included that quote, unchecked, mistruthful, from Derek Fox. Ultimately, the BCS's best defense is an ignorant media. And that's why when Dan asked me to come on board and help write this book with him, I jumped at it. Someone needed to tell the truth about this racket. I understand. We're talking about college football here. Ultimately, in the grand scheme of things, it's very benign. This is nothing more than a pastime to us. But I've been doing this job for 15 years now, and I've come to learn what sports means to people. They really do feel victimized when their team is told it's not good enough. They feel powerless. The anger is pervasive. They want something else. Now, agents of change do exist. Mark Cuban, the Dallas Mavericks owner, wants to start his own playoff. A group of rogue congressional aides that calls themselves Playoff Pack wants to do something, and they've become the Upton Sinclair of bowl games. They've been muckraking. They've been finding all sorts of things out. I love those guys. They made our job much, much easier. And Utah's Attorney General, Mark Shurtleff, is trying to get a coalition of other attorney generals together to start up an antitrust suit. Now, antitrust litigation is expensive. It takes a long time. That may not be the best route because, frankly, from what we've heard from people since the publication of this book, the BCS may not be long for this world. The cartel's getting tired of defending it. And I don't blame them, because it's really tough to defend the indefensible. The TV contract runs out in 2014, and by that point, maybe, just maybe, we will get the 14 playoff that we're looking for. Now, the response has been remarkable from fans. Death to the BCS became something of a rallying cry. It wasn't like people were going around with pitchforks and torches trying to burn down the house of Jim Delaney, the Big Ten Conference Commissioner, but there was enough interest in this where people were asking the same question that I suppose is asked here at a school of public service very often. How can I help? And the answer is very simple. Buy Death to the BCS because I have 2 children and I really need to send them to college. Or if you want to do something for free, use your voice. Tell a friend. Inform a family member. Email the chancellor of the university here, or at Arkansas State, or in California, or in Ohio, anywhere. Just explain one thing to them. How it makes you mad that these CEOs are making hundreds of thousands of dollars a year and taking money from your school. How players actually want a playoff system. Or the silly polls, or the mathematically bankrupt computers. Easiest thing would just be talk about the Fiesta Bowl. There's 276 pages of an internal investigation. If you want to laugh, you can go ahead and read those. It was the funniest thing I read all of last year. Just tell the truth. From the first word we wrote of Death to the BCS, that's all we wanted to do. We knew this book might affect change, and it might not. But as long as people closed that final page and felt like they finally knew about the dirt and the corruption that's inherent in this system, we were satisfied. And the funniest thing has happened since. Every so often I'll get a message on Twitter or over email, and it will be someone who is thanking me for making them angry. They say, I have never been so mad after reading a book, and I love it. It's been so much fun. Thank you for telling me. It's crazy to hear about from these people because, you don't want to make anybody mad, but you're glad that they at least know. And the people, they're genuinely appreciative. And it's edifying to know that we've done a small service. More and more, through reading the book, through speeches like this, people understand the disease that has metastasized through college football. There is a way to get rid of it. All you have to do is tell someone, and as the word spreads, people say something to each other, it's going to get to the right people. And once that happens, ultimately, the final victim is going to be the BCS itself. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. Will you tell us the objective?
Yeah, Skip really wanted to know what a playoff system would look like this year. And so I hadn't drawn this up. We have the last 5 years in our book. And so I sat down before this, and every year there are amazing matchups that come together if you just draw up this mock bracket. The mock brackets, I think, make me angrier than just about anything else, just seeing the games that could be. I'm just going to say the 1-16 game this year would be Louisiana State versus Louisiana Tech. How huge would that be in the state of Louisiana? All the kids who did not get into LSU, did not get recruited by LSU, end up at Louisiana Tech, and now they would get a chance to beat that team in Tiger Stadium. 8 versus 9, Wisconsin versus Boise State. You have the smash-mouthingest team in the country from Wisconsin versus the upstart from Boise that gets to go play off of its blue turf. Southern Miss and Oregon, West Virginia versus Stanford. I love that matchup. Andrew Luck, the quarterback from Stanford, his father, Oliver Luck, is the athletic director at West Virginia. So he would be playing his dad in that game. Now, I have Oklahoma State as the number 2 seed. I know I'm in SEC country here. There may be people, all right, I saw a fist raised in the back there. There we go. Frankly, the reason I put them there, Oklahoma State has a better schedule this year. They've beaten more teams that actually matter, more teams that actually count. Their loss was worse, but their best wins were better, and I'm going to go with the wins every time over a fluky loss. They would play Northern Illinois. Kansas State against TCU, another great matchup. TCU is going to be going into the Big 12 next year. They get to face Kansas State a year early. Here's the one you guys really want to hear about. At Razorback Stadium, a game that could ultimately lead to a national championship. Clemson would come to town and visit Arkansas. And if you guys win that game, the next week you would face the winner of Alabama and Arkansas State. I swear I did not jerry-rig this bracket in any way to have that happen. But you would either go down to Bryant-Denny Stadium to get revenge on that loss throughout the regular season, or you would have the biggest game ever in Arkansas, bar none, by far. And it would be a good game, too. That's the thing. I think that would really be a great matchup. All right. Are you going to get run out of this room right now, or? And that's it. So I mean, the idea, frankly, that we're giving up all those games, I mean, you know, maybe K-State, TCU doesn't matter to you. Maybe Oklahoma State, Northern Illinois doesn't matter to you in the regular season. But when this is a playoff, when your team could be playing that team a round later or 2 rounds later, when your home games matter on what other people do, when you have all of that excitement, the college football world already is so interconnected and intertwined through the internet and through message boards and through Twitter and through all the social media out there these days. The world would melt down if there were a college football playoff with excitement. Think about looking forward to the next 4 weeks. Just this week, you would have a week off, and then you would get into that game. The build. From Arkansas and Arkansas State going to a playoff as opposed to the Cotton Bowl and the GoDaddy.com Bowl. I mean, that's all you need to know right there. Playoff or GoDaddy.com Bowl? I think I'll take the playoff.
We do have time for some questions, so please raise your hand. We'll get a microphone to you. Johnny.
I read the first edition of the book also, and one thing I was curious about, earlier this year, the Arizona Republic did the big series about the BCS, and especially with the Arizona Republic being in Phoenix, in that area where the Fiesta Bowl is, what kind of impact did you think will come from those articles?
You know, I'd like to think that they're going to change something, but honestly, I know better by now. I mean, we wrote a 230-page book that's not your typical narrative book. This is an argument. This is like, it's a legal briefing with some snark and some humor and some things that are going to absolutely horrify you and going to make you laugh. But more than anything else, what we say is based on logic. And everything that's out there, you'd like to think that the people in the ivory towers would actually listen to it. But they don't. They don't care. They don't care that they get sullied. They don't care that they get exposed. They just keep going on, and that's the most frustrating part about the BCS. It's like a cockroach in nuclear war. It just will not die. And hopefully, somebody, whether it's the presidents banding together, whether it's ESPN, which has greater influence over college football than just about anybody, putting its foot down, somebody in that position of power, not just a couple of reporters from Yahoo who wrote the book, not just a reporter from the Arizona Republic who put together this great series of stories, somebody who can truly influence them and make the decisions will do what their predecessors haven't done. A lot of people, frankly, are waiting for Jim Delaney, the aforementioned Big Ten Conference Commissioner, to retire, because he's the person who more than anything is keeping the BCS in place right now. Mike Slive, who's the commissioner of the SEC, a few years back, went to his fellow conference commissioners and said, I think we should do a +1. Now, a +1 is a 14 playoff. Now, Mike Slive stands to benefit greatly from this +1 because every year there are probably going to be 2 SEC teams in it. And so, of course, he's looking out for himself, his conference. He's trying to grab the knife. And Jim Delaney, knowing that the Big Ten isn't nearly as strong as it used to be, and that the power in the Big Ten is left in its television footprint and the number of people who its area covers, organized a group that said no, no way, no chance, no how. And right there, like that, BCS was still in play.
Todd, in the back.
Hey, thanks for coming out. I have a You mentioned ESPN, and you mentioned that they're being very powerful influence on college sports. And I want to talk to you. I want you to talk more about that, because I feel like coming up, watching ESPN, it was a pleasure. It was almost a treat. It was that show it was a channel you didn't miss when you're a college student. When I was a college student coming up, and now it's become this entity that reminds me a lot of Fox News. I mean, they really control a lot of things that goes on in sports. Their influence is almost is beyond what it should be as a news channel. And just this.
Well, they ceased to be a news channel a long time ago. Right. I mean, let's get this straight. And the thing about ESPN is it could be a vehicle for change and a vehicle for good if the people who actually commentated and who were analysts understood what's going on. The vast majority of them. Now, whether this is because ESPN owns the rights to the BCS and they don't want to badmouth their product on air, if it's because Bill Hancock has called them up, pissing and moaning about what they have said or what someone has said or what they've done, or whether it's because they're just plain old ignorant, they haven't taken that advocate's role because, frankly, it's quite simple. They're compromised. That's one good thing about working at Yahoo. We are not compromised by anybody. We have no tie-ins. We can actually go out there and tell the truth. And one of the greatest things when this book came out last year was when Game Day on ESPN was down at TCU. And Gary Patterson, the fantastic coach there, was up on the set. And Chris Fowler went rogue. Chris Fowler pulled out a copy of Death to the BCS, held it up for the cameras, and handed it over to the coach. And it was a great moment for us because, we were finally validated by the mothership. And it was nice to know that people there actually do think what the truth is. They do understand why we're pushing for this, and they're on board with us. There are just certain things, unfortunately, that prevent them from saying so. And if you watch some of whether it's the BCS selection show or whether it's just analysis during the regular season, the number of people who are on board with the BCS, it just looks like Pravda. I mean, it looks like state-run television, and that's what ESPN has turned into when it comes to the BCS.
Okay, you've got schools like Arkansas that right now, I think it's 32 days out until the Cotton Bowl. The school is kind of in frantic mode, doing tickets, all this logistical stuff to actually participate in a bowl in which they're not even doing all the planning. Okay, so you're talking about logic. Logistically, how can they plan for such a short notice sort of thing where they've got to put on this big production at their home site where, let's say they're an 8 and they didn't even know. They might be in a game. So how do they plan this? I mean, how does that work logistically? And then the second question is about how do you come to that top 16?
It's a great question, both of them. The first one, we talked with operations people at universities across the country because that's a very good point to make. Could they put the game on in a week's time? These places are well-oiled machines. They would very easily be able to do so in the same manner that baseball teams within 2 days, if you get into the playoffs on the last day of the season, you have a game 2 days later. And you know what? They managed to open the stadium. They managed to sell all the tickets. They managed to get the concessionaires ready, whether it's paying them a little extra money. They may have to do that. But fact is, those tickets are going to sell so quickly and the hype is going to be so massive, it's incumbent upon them to do that. What was the second question? How do you come to the playoff? Of course. A selection committee. Now, you can argue that the selection committee in the NCAA tournament every year for basketball misses some things, has some troubles, may not do the best job. I'd argue that they do a fantastic job almost every year. It's really difficult to differentiate, especially among those lower teams. And you know what? I got a list here of teams that are left off. Boise State was the last team in from what we did today. But you could have left, you could make an argument for Oklahoma, Georgia, Virginia Tech, Michigan State, Michigan, South Carolina, Baylor. What do those teams all have in common? They all have 2 or 3 losses. And you know what? If you want to be angry about not making that game, you should have won your games. It's as simple as that. I mean, just go win your games and you'll get in the playoffs. I think part of that argument, frankly, who got left out, there's something healthy about that. I won't disagree with the BCS. The best thing it's got going for it is that people get really mad about it and talk about it. And that's what we've been doing for the last 24 hours. We've been saying how bad the BCS is. But every time we say that, those 3 letters we mentioned, still, BCS, get ingrained in our head because of it.
In the back.
I was just wondering if in all of your work looking at this, anybody's ever given you a decent explanation as to why a Division I playoff would harm the academic interests of the student athlete when it doesn't in every other level of football, or in the 3 weeks where players go all over the country for the NCAA basketball tournament.
Bless Jim Delaney's heart. He actually said that the academic argument is complete bunk. And it is. I mean, if you want to talk about the excessive travel, look at where some conferences are these days. I believe Boise State's going to be playing in the Big East next year, right? And I believe Texas Christian was going to be playing in the Big East as well. They lost the moral argument a long, long time ago through the NCAA basketball tournament, through spreading the teams out throughout the country. That's been gone for a long time, and you know what? The kids always figure out how to get their schoolwork done. They would figure out how to get it done here too.
Yeah, what's your best guess of what it's going to look like in 2 years when they re-up?
I think they're going to do a +1. I think they'll have a 14 playoff. And, you know, from the start, the people who run the BCS have been worried about what they call bracket creep. That's the idea that if you have, 4 teams, well, you're going to get greedy, and then you're going to want 8 teams. And if you have 8 teams, well, you're going to dilute it, and you're going to end up with 16 teams. And you know what? To them, I say, good. 16-team tournament is exactly what they need. And I hope that this 4-team tournament that hopefully is going to come up is as wildly successful as it can possibly be. Because you know what? If they have that success, ultimately, the people who run the game are going to say, well, what we have now is pretty good, but, well, 8 might be pretty good too, so might as well go to 8. What's the harm in that? It's why the NCAA tournament expanded from 32 to 64 to 65 to 68. Even though you're bringing in lower-end teams there at the end, the tournament is still great, the tournament is still the same, and the tournament, frankly, is more profitable now.
We'll go to our Arkansas State fan. Sorry for your loss.
Yeah, my heart was broken today. I would like to say that the GoDaddy.com Bowl is a very prestigious bowl that we are proud to be a part of. And I can't disagree that there is corruption in the BCS system, and where there's money, there's going to be corruption. And we even see that at a lower level. Just here in Arkansas, we've had some turmoil amongst our university presidents and so on. But I don't think that if you change the BCS to a playoff, you'd necessarily get rid of the corruption. It would just move. And then also, the old argument of every game matters. Once you get to the argument you had, you should have won your game if you want to get in the 16-team playoff. Well, we could be saying that to Oklahoma State right now. I really like that every game matters. I really like the idea that ASU, who's in the Sun Belt, is never, in the near future, is never going to beat a BCS school or an automatic qualifying school. But we get to go to the GoDaddy Bowl, where we get to play a team, and we can feel like we're champions of that team. So anyway, just address that. Do you really think that this is the best system for choosing a champion and the best system for a great season?
Well, hold the mic for a sec. Let me ask you a question. Would you rather beat Alabama at Bryant-Denny Stadium, or would you rather win the GoDaddy.com Bowl?
Well, we get a...
Would you rather play Alabama at Bryant-Denny Stadium, or would you rather win the GoDaddy?
We have played Alabama at Bryant-Denny Stadium a couple times and got a good paycheck and made a lot of money. We're not going to make any money at the GoDaddy Bowl, I'm sure, but
you will lose a significant amount of money.
Exactly. Well, we've sold a lot of tickets. Anyway, all that to say, I would like to be a part of a game that I know we're going to have a chance at. But then again, beating an Alabama at Bryant-Denny, that puts us on the stage that winning a GoDaddy does not. I just, if we're a Boise State, yeah, we have a great opportunity. But there's one Boise State, and there's a lot of, schools that want to be there.
Well, what I think the last few years have proven, frankly, is that there can be a Boise State anywhere. I mean, honestly, who the hell thought Arkansas State was going to come and go 10-2 this year? Well, aside from you. And I don't know if anyone else in here. Boise State, you know, the Boise State story to me that stands out the most, there's a kid named Kyle Wilson who was a first-round pick for the New York Jets, I believe. Kyle Wilson was from Piscataway, New Jersey, and went to school in Boise, Idaho. It's a really long flight, and it shows that if you are successful and if you build a program the correct way, you can recruit from anywhere. You can recruit to Arkansas State. It's as simple as that. And as far as the whole BCS goes, you know, this is just me as a fan, and maybe it's because I'm from Cleveland and I've never had a championship of any kind in my entire life. But I don't want to settle for being the winner of something mediocre. I'd rather be a loser in something huge, and I'd rather try and go for that big thing than just settle to be, you know, in a bowl game that nobody else watches. You know how many people's eyeballs would be on the Alabama-Arkansas State game? A lot more than the GoDaddy.com bowl game, that's for certain.
Will you, I can't remember if you touched on it, the payout of the playoffs, of your playoffs, and so each team is split.
Yeah, well, you know, it was so much easier. I haven't done the math since I changed the number to $1 billion, so let's just go with $750 million. There are 15 games, 2 teams in each game. 30 games, divide $750 million, that is $25 million per team per game. Right now, the BCS Bowls pay out individually less than that. And so the idea that in Arkansas State, for example, could take $25 million back to the Sun Belt Conference and split it up evenly, what that would do for athletic departments. 90% of athletic departments are in the red annually. 90%. That would bring the vast majority into the black. It would make sure that while University of Arkansas is a self-sufficient athletic department, a majority out there end up relying on taxpayers, end up relying on student fees, end up subsidizing their basketball and their football teams and all the other athletics there, just because that's the way that it works now, and that's the way that they have actually settled for. And it's sad to see so many athletic departments settling for such mediocrity when something out there can fix it.
Yellow man.
Since you were talking about Oklahoma State earlier, do you think it was a good call that Alabama is going to the championship to play LSU instead of Oklahoma State?
How old are you?
10.
You're smart. That's a great question. That's an excellent question. Now, are you an Alabama fan or are you an Oklahoma State? You're Alabama? Okay, you're not going to like what I have to say then. I can see an argument on either side. You know what? Alabama lost 1 game this year. It was by 3 points, and it was to the best team in the country. Oklahoma State lost 1 game this year. It was to a 6-6 team. It was in double overtime. But the thing to me that makes the biggest difference is that Oklahoma State won some games against some really good teams. Alabama, they beat Arkansas. It's a really good team. Aside from that, though, they didn't play a whole lot this year as far as great competition. This was a down year for the SEC, no question about it. I don't know if the Big 12 was better necessarily, but again, there can be an argument made for it. And that's one of the things that I think a playoff, even a 4-team playoff, would settle. Now, you're always going to have teams being left out. I understand that. But at least in this particular year, we would see the 2 versus 3, the Alabama versus Oklahoma State. Even though I would seed Oklahoma State number 2, I think Alabama's a better team than them. So I do think Alabama is going to give LSU a better game than Oklahoma State would. Okay. It's a long walk.
You mentioned the Mark Cuban $500 million offer and all that, and now that Oklahoma State is, now that T. Boone Pickens didn't get the championship he paid for, what was Mark Cuban's offer, and could money solve it? If Jim Delaney never dies, could money solve it?
Jim Delaney's never going to die, actually. They're just going to freeze him and going to, no. You'd like to think money can solve the issue, but there's money out there already in this playoff system, and the one that we're proposing. I mean, I know for a fact that television networks have gone to the people who run the BCS and have said, we will pay you an exorbitant amount of money if you just switch over to the system. And they are so stubborn and they are just so ignorant to the will of the people. That to me is the most frustrating part of this whole thing. Like when I said 99%, I'm serious. Now granted, the majority of the people who read our book are anti-BCS because the majority of people out there are anti-BCS, but even the pro-BCS people who read this book end up getting flipped over. And so when Mark Cuban goes and gives a Godfather offer like that, says that I want the money to go toward academics, toward education, toward building great leaders for America in the future, I want to use football as a greater thing, and that gets turned down, what does that tell you about the priorities of the people who are in charge? They're obviously misplaced, and they're just in a terrible place at this point.
Yeah, you've mentioned the university presidents a couple of times. Since the book's come out, do you feel like, or have you gotten any feedback from them, or do you feel like you're getting any traction with them as far as your argument goes?
Oh yeah, we've heard from a lot of presidents who have said, I had no idea. The problem is none of them is willing to stand up in front of his or her fellow university presidents and say, why don't we change this? Now, you have the smaller conferences. Of course, they want to do this because they want their share of the pie to be bigger, but they're persona non grata at these meetings, you know. Ultimately, it comes down to what the Power Six want. It is their will, it is their way, and they're the ones who determine this. And until they get on board, and trust me, we have a good number on board, but not enough yet to change the system. Until they get on board as a majority, it's just going to be the same, or it's going to be a 4-team playoff as opposed to the 16 that it needs to be in order for this to really, truly work well and benefit everyone who deserves to be benefited by it.
Last question, Alex.
Hi, thank you very much for coming out. I really enjoyed it. I had a question touching on a few points that were brought up earlier about just how literally in the last few months, sometimes overnight or week to week, conferences were adding teams, subtracting teams, all of that. I think there is a strong belief, at least by a lot of sports writers, that that current trend isn't going to stop, how this is kind of the new normal, and how in the coming couple of years, you're going to have a lot of conferences completely just fold up, collapse, super conferences with, 16, 20 teams that are geographically ridiculous. But at some point, is that trend a variable that factors into the death of the BCS perhaps, where these conferences and even individual schools like Texas and the Longhorn Network are going to incentivize their own best interest and their own financial path and kind of say, forget the NCAA, I'm going to make my own money, and I'm not going to divide it out among, a national organization like the NCAA. I'm just going to make it a smaller organization. Do you think these super conferences could essentially franchise themselves, put their own playoff in, and just put the NCAA in the rearview mirror?
It's one of the things about the college sports landscape right now. It is just so open for everything. I mean, it's like the wild, wild west. It is a frontier that could have a million different possibilities. And I think you could make the argument that the super conferences will lead to the BCS's death, but I also think that you can make an even better argument that all of the conference changing going on right now would not have happened if the BCS weren't in play. This was all for money. This was all to end up in a place that was stable. Because right now, in the current system, there are only 4 conferences that are stable. The ACC, that's sort of tenuous itself, the Big Ten, the SEC, and the Pac-12. The Big 12 and the Big East are on very, very shaky ground right now. And so if you had that money coming in, this is about money ultimately. This is about the money, and this is about the division, and this is about the power. The money part, though, would have been the glue for keeping these conferences together. And if you had the money there from the playoff system, then I don't think teams like Missouri, like Nebraska, like Colorado, like Texas A&M would have been nearly as quick to jump to these different conferences as they were. I went to Syracuse University. I loved the Big East basketball tournament. It was one of my favorite things every year. I remember the 6 overtime game with UConn. It was one of the best sporting events I have ever seen. That's gone. All the history, all the tradition, everything gone because of instability that could have been taken away if you had just gotten rid of the BCS.
Well, Jeff, thank you so much for coming. The 2011 version is over here.
Thank you.